Hello, I'm Will.
I'm Carne.
Welcome to the last episode of Tsarist Russia.
We're free!
Russia and the First World War.
Oh, we're almost free. I can finally stop doing this rubbish. Yeah. Moving on.
Right, okay, Section 5, Russia and the First World War. In July 1914, Nicholas was faced with the choice. Back down or mobilise the army completely. Here, his credibility is on the line, or Russia's credibility is on the line after backing down before and after the Russo-Japanese War. Nicholas has to go for full mobilisation. However, it will cause a series of events. The Schlieffen Plan, which you mentioned, means the Germans will go and attack the French, even though they technically haven't done anything at this point. So the more Russia mobilised, the less chance we'll have it working. So Russia has announced full mobilisation to aid Serbia against Austria. This is trouble for Germany. So in August 1914, Russia enters the First World War. Schlieffen Plan, France under severe pressure. Russia unexpectedly swiftly advance in the east, etc., etc. Basically, what happens, Connor?
Well, Russian does pretty well for a while.
No, it doesn't. There's a massive blow.
Hang on. I meant socially.
Germany brings some troops back from going to the west, headed by Hindenburg and Ludendorff. They see an opportunity for a massive blow on Russian armies. At Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes, the Russian armies are overwhelmed due to bad leadership. This may have mucked up Germany's Schlieffen Plan, but it mucks up the Russians more. A tiny little fact that I will throw here, I know we're not meant to, is that one of the extent of how bad they ran this war is they were using radio communications that weren't coded.
Yeah.
And so literally the Germans were just listening to what they were about to do, and then they went away for them. Idiots. Right. September 1914, Russia is defeated by East Prussia, in East Prussia by the Germans at Tannenberg, losing twice as many men as Germany. 1915, the Schlieffen Plan has failed and Germany go on the offensive on the Eastern Front. They break through and advance into Poland, 80 kilometres with 100,000 Russian losses. Germany goes on the defensive in the Western Front. France, Switzerland is. In 1915, the Tsar makes a decision to relieve his uncle as the commander-in-chief. This was a mistake for two reasons. There is no longer a scapegoat. If it goes wrong, it's going to be his fault and not anyone else's. Leaving St. Petersburg and leaving St. Petersburg to the running of Russia to his wife Tsarina Alexandra is a bad idea because she's nationally hated because she's German and they're fighting the Germans. In March 1916, at Lake Marach, Russians attack and are driven back despite superiority in men, guns, and ammunition. Described as the worst managed battle of the entire war, as they lost another 100,000 men. June 1916, the Brusilov offensive in Galicia advanced 60 kilometres. That's the Russians at the expense of Austrians, the C team, to the A team Germans. So they weren't even fighting the Germans. But it's what is called as a Pyrrhic victory because it was so costly it's hard to tell it from a defeat. The amount of Russians killed or wounded or taken prisoner was 1 million men. The Russian army by 1917 had 1.7 million dead, 8 million wounded, 2.5 million will be prisoner, and either Austria or Germany, which has two serious consequences. One, the officer corps. The opposition naturally aimed to shoot the officers first, and therefore they all died, even though they were the Tsar supporters, which leaves the intelligentsia, because it needs to be educated, as the officer corps, which means they're unreliable, as they're the biggest critics of the Tsar. So the army is being run by the biggest critics rather than the biggest supporters. The recruits, before they had to go through a period of training, and now it's a lot less lax because they just need people. This led to the character of the army changing. The government has always relied on them, but by 1917 they have got an unloyal army. So, yeah, when war broke out, this is another example of how stupid the government were. When the war broke out in Russia, they had 4.7 million rifles, but called up 6.5 million men. Do the maths. July 1915, the French ambassador was told that 1/3 of the units had no rifles. There was also a shortage of shells, however, that was true for everyone. But this meant that people were losing respect for the government. There was a supply, but it was a supply problem rather than a manufacturing problem. They had all these things, but they just weren't getting it there. Like food rotted before it even got to the front. The cost of the war was enormous.
In 1916, they were spending nearly 5 times as much as in 1913. But how did they pay for it? They got loans from Britain and France. They got lots of taxation. They got the rich this time, sort of the landlords and the intelligentsia, to pay more. They printed massive amounts of money, which caused huge inflation. This caused a kind of living standards as prices rocket. In 1913 to 1917, prices rise by 400%, which was particularly serious in the towns, and food is becoming dear. 20% less food in the markets in 1916 and 1914. Why sell it when you need it? Peasantry are keeping more food as a consequence of the inflation. St. Petersburg, which is renamed as Petrograd, people were queuing for bread for 8 hours per loaf by 1917. Naturally, the Russian people were seeing hardship and no apparent success. This is a world war, a national emergency. It needs to be a government of a national unity. They should embrace the Duma and get everyone behind the Tsar, but Nicholas will not share power.
The Carne in October 1916 produced a report saying that the economic conditions of the masses were appalling, particularly in St. Petersburg. 750,000 working days were lost due to strike action, 4 times more than in 1915. Initially, they were about food and living standards, and then they needed the end of the war, and then they moved on to the removing of the Tsar. In 1917, the Carne is saying that they only need a spark and it will all explode. They're on the edge of revolution. The peasantry are enjoying high prices for their food, but there is a shortage due to the shortage of labour. The bulk of the army is peasants. 15 million served in the army, which is formed of roughly 80% peasants. Also, farm animals are drafted in for the war, meaning agriculture is struggling. Boots are expensive, clothing is dear, so the basics, they're all dear, you know, so expensive. On top of that, they get a message telling them that loved ones have died and they want land. In 1916, over 300 attacks on nobles and their estates by the peasantry. 90 of those attacks were so serious that the army had to be brought in.
Right, so the result of this is there needed to be a capable head of state and an effective government. The Tsar had gone to the front, leaving his duties to the Tsarina Alexandra and, in turn, Grigory Rasputin. They are self-serving and blinkered. Alexandra would take loyalty before usefulness. In 1916, the British ambassador Buchanan asks the Tsar to regain the confidence of his people. The Tsar replies, saying that they should gain his confidence. Ooh. Ministerial leapfrog. In 1915, there were 5 different ministers of the interior, 3 different war ministers, and 4 different agricultural ministers. So there's no continuous consistency in any of any policies.
Ministerial leapfrog.
The Tsarina was deeply unpopular, mainly because she's a German. Also, she was accused of being a spy, and her relationship with Rasputin was common knowledge, losing the monarchy's respect. He also has a famous case of Rasputin going on top of a tower and swinging his penis around, saying this controls all of Russia. So there's a highly suspicious relationship there. Members of the Romanov family, the Tsar's aunt and uncle, seriously contemplate removing Nicholas to save the regime. And in 1914, the Duma rallied around the government and granted a huge war budget, but that is all Nicholas wanted from them. This frustrated the Duma members as they were looking for a constitutional monarchy and lost a lot of support in the government.
Now the Liberals have been lost, basically. The people that had ended the revolution in 1905 by splitting the opposition, they have now been lost. Criticism of the Tsar, the committees and institutions. The Duma set up provisional committee to aid war victims. The Zemstva also attempt to nationally help the war effort, and they take charge of this committee, leading to the Union of Zemstvas to care for health. The WIC, Central War Industries Committee, was also set up in the Duma in 1915 to be more efficient. Both of these things display non-government bodies doing government work, meaning the beginning of an alternative form of government institutions that don't need the Tsar. 1915, a large number of Duma members are unhappy with how it's being run. Right-wing groups, like the Octoberists and the Cadets, notably the most loyal, are also upset. The most upset even, and start to protest. A progressive bloc wants to dump the ministers and base the government on the Dumas. 300 out of 430 Duma members, in fact. They call for a new government, even embracing the ideas of Kerensky of the SRs, but Nicholas ignores them. And in November 1916, there was open criticism of the government. And his own family starts seeking the Prime Minister and the members and talking about replacing Nicholas. And in December 1916, Rasputin is assassinated by the nobility and Alexandra is beside herself, which leads Connor to tell us all about
the February Revolution of 1917. This was caused by a deterioration of living standards in Russia. The peasantry had the high prices of goods and lots of land issues. Again, the 300 incidents attacking nobility. The Dumas were being constantly ignored by Nicholas. Even his family were exasperated at his wife and Rasputin. Ministers kept being replaced. The Okhrana said that the cities are at boiling point, is the quote there. Always contribute to a lack of an effective government. This is the scene by February 1917.
Very quickly, February the 14th, the Tsar dissolves the Duma. February the 22nd, a lockout of the Putilov Arms Works, that's the Metal Works, one of the biggest unions, leaves people on the streets in demonstration. On the 23rd, International Women's Day, Bolsheviks call for women to come out on strike, and they get a large response, with more factories emptying on strike. At 10 o'clock, there are 20,000 by midday, 50,000 by the afternoon, 90,000. That escalates to with the war to down with the Tsar. And food shops are looted, including bakeries. And we told you how bad the bread was. On the 24th, the next day, there are more demonstrations. In fact, 200,000 in St. Petersburg. Too many for the police to even do anything, but they naturally disperse. On the 25th, the protesters return with more. 240,000 on the streets. And it is a complete shutdown in St. Petersburg. They want bread, better living conditions, and there is a mix of political views too. Then, the Tsar is informed of its severity. Remember, he's on the front or near to it. A Duma members need to be a national government. Nicholas tells him to use the army, but General Kabalov makes it clear, that's the person who told him, that troops in St. Petersburg aren't reliable, because they've only recently been conscripted. The only reliable ones are the Cossacks or the horsemen. One killed a policeman, showed that the troops are starting to question their authority. Yet, against his better judgment, Kabalov is told to crack down. On the 26th, troops are put onto the streets and ordered to fire at demonstrators. Shots are fired, but then the troops start to wave it, and some turn their guns on the police. On the 27th, one regiment is asked to open fire, and they refuse. That's the Volhynsky regiment. And they shoot their officer. This is a full-scale mutiny, and they join the protesters along with more and more troops. Within 2 days, 170,000 troops had joined the demonstrations. The red flag of socialism was put up over the Winter Palace, showing that Nicholas had lost his capital. Ex-Duma members see what is happening on the streets, and they know that the Tsar is finished. They see the power vacuum and decide to fill it with a new form of government, the provisional government. They're self-appointed, and the government is only temporary until a national election. Tsar travels back. Tsar is travelling back when telegrams flood in and says exactly what's happening, basically. Faced by the lack of the support, he abdicates on March the 2nd, in the hope that his brother, Grand Duke Mikhail, will take up the throne. On the March the 3rd, he says he won't, and the Romanov family monarchy has been overthrown. Grand Duke Mikhail says, I leave the power to the Duma and the provisional government and Connor Durkin.
I have the power?
He has the power!
Yay. The new authorities. After Tsar's abdication, Russia was left with two ruling authorities, dual government. They had the provisional, that's the one, government, and the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers, so the Petrograd Soviet. Which was actually more democratic than the government, agreed to accept the provisional government's authority until a constituent assembly, until the government was properly brought in. So this led to a dual power leadership. This kind of weakened both because neither could do any serious reforms without the consent of the other. So the provisional government kept having to turn to the Petrograd Soviet.
And the Soviet was the main running force. Even though the provisional government are in charge, if you like, the Soviet is really the ones that are making...
They control all the army and the
railways. An example is Order Number 1, which aimed to abolish the death penalty. And it's clearly by the Soviet because... the provisional government don't want that. They need to discipline somehow, and that basically lose all discipline. And that's a good example.
Right, so the immediate changes made by these two dual authorities include civil liberty, so civil rights, the abolition of legal restrictions based on class, so no bias in the legal system, an amnesty for politicians, military and religious prisoners, the abolition of capital punishment, there we go, as you said there, the appointment of independent judges, self-government for the army, the right of the Petrograd garrison to retain weapons, the imprisonment of Tsarist officials, the appointment of liberal commissars to replace provincial governors, disbanding of secret police, lifting of censorship, establishment of Soviets in different towns and in countryside, independence for the Poles behind the German lines, and other nationalities were told to await a constituent assembly. Now, these reactions had very mixed reactions, really. The peasants had initial enthusiasm, which turned to frustration in the absence of any official land redistribution, which is what they were going for. The workers weren't really that happy because the provisional government didn't really have any power over them, to be honest. Soldiers, committees were established and
basically start leaving. Yeah. So the provisional government are faced with two decisions that would make or break it. Do they continue the war? Naturally, liberal instincts is not to continue the war. It's to continue the war, sorry. However, people are sick of it, and yet they continue the war, which makes them very unpopular. Peasants are seizing land, this is the second one, from the landowners, and there is nobody, the army or the police, to stop them. Will they recognise the peasant seizure of land? No one can tell them that it isn't theirs, so if you can't stop something, you should accept it. But they do not do this, because they are too legal when they saw it as stealing. The peasantry saw this as the fact that the provisional government could possibly take it back later when they had the resources, like the police. This creates suspicion of the government, thus taking away the peasantry's support. Peasants are also deserting from the front to get to the land. To get land, other peasants are gaining. The army is breaking down. Nothing can be done about it due to Order 21.
1914, when war broke out, divided. Socialists. When the war broke out, the left wing were divided. Socialists supported the war, despite usually being very against it. Mensheviks and the Social Revolutionaries supported it, and the only ones who didn't were the Bolsheviks. Lenin welcomed it so it would bring about revolution, but by 1916 he was very pessimistic about this chance. However, in March 1917 he hears that the Tsar has fallen, so he's desperate to get back to Russia, because he can't really control the revolution from his exile in Switzerland. He would have to go through all the battle lines in Europe on the train. The Germans would help him because he would undermine Russia's war efforts so they can turn their attention to the British and the French before the Americans arrived to fight against them. Mm-hmm. As Lenin comes back in April 17 and he's placed in a sealed train from Switzerland sent to Russia, arriving in Finland Station in St. Petersburg, funded by the Germans, filled with German money.
Yeah. He finds the Bolsheviks jailed, but no, the jailed Bolsheviks have been released and returned to St. Petersburg, including Stalin, the editor of their paper. They are supporting the bourgeoisie's provisional government because Marxist theory states that there will be basically there'll be two revolutions: the landowner, the bourgeoisie revolution, and then the workers' revolution. So this is only the second revolution. Or the first, depending on how you look at it, so it's not ready. Lenin's furious because, frankly, his personality, in 50 years, when it might come naturally, the workers' revolution, he won't be there to lead it. So he developed an April thesis, which said, no cooperation with the provisional government, all power to the Soviets, Bolshevik slogan, which was peace, bread, land. Lenin is basically saying he's an opportunist, and he's seeing that the peasantry is being left out. No one's really grasping the power of the peasantry. So that's why he sticks land in there, to sort of get the peasantry on the side, even though traditionally Marxists think of them as anti-revolutionaries. The provisional government, on the other hand, are in trouble. They're made up largely of cadets and constitutional Democrats who are in favour of the war, seeing it as honourable and a way of regaining authority. The Mensheviks and the SRs are divided between peace and supporting the cadets. The Bolsheviks benefit as they have never supported the war, and their numbers rise. February 1917, 10,000 party members with more supporting them. July 1917, 75,000 party members with more supporting them. But their support is largely in the cities, and this is where the support matters. March to May 1917, 365,000 Russian troops desert from the front. In 237 villages, peasants seized the noble estates in July 1917, and the cities are still a major problem for the provincial government, as there are food shortages. That's important, food shortages, remember that in a minute. After February 1917, production is collapsing, remember that as well, due to a lack of authority. Farmers are selling less food, and the blame is put onto the provincial government, even though it's not really their fault, it's how the country was given to them. Lenin is providing an ideal alternative. And coming July, I believe. Yeah.
And Lenin's April thesis, this peace, land, bread thing, also inspired a number of sort of revolutionary events that happened during July. The July days themselves were just soldiers, an armed insurrection by soldiers and sailors, which were eventually fired on by police and arrested. And then you had the Kornilov affair, which was a General Kornilov, who sort of almost revolted with the army and supposedly marched.
Sorry, I should say a very important thing. In the July days, it was basically everyone turning to Lenin and saying, lead us. And Lenin was unprepared and said no. The authorities seized that chance, said, how did you get here? The Germans helped you. He's a German spy. Lenin, now in Finland. Go.
Right. Kornilov affair.
Very important, that
General
bit.
Kornilov sort of... He said he was protecting the city, but he marched with armed troops on Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and then the government sort of panicked and said he's going to overthrow us, so then they armed the Petrograd Soviet. They called on the Soviet, the provisional government, said to the Soviet, please help us, you have control of these massive armies. So they armed 40,000 of the Petrograd Soviet.
Including the Bolsheviks.
Yeah, gave them all weapons and said protect us. And it turns out the Bolsheviks were able to persuade General Kornilov to turn around and not attack the city. So this put provisional government in a really bad position, because then it's just armed its complete arch nemesis, and it made itself look weak by having to ask the provisional government, the Petrograd, for help.
As a result of this, Lenin seizes the opportunity and comes back.
Yes, he does.
In secret.
In secret, indeed.
By the way, that was the Kornilov coup on August the 27th, 1917.
Indeed. On the 7th of October, Lenin returned secretly to Petrograd. Kerensky, which is the leader of the provisional government, fearing uprising, ordered army units loaned to certain radical soldiers. Blah, blah, blah. 9th of October, Petrograd Soviet set up a military committee to start the revolution.
September 1917, I should say, the Bolsheviks win big in the Soviet election, so they're actually doing well politically anyway before whatever is about to happen.
And then 10th of October, Lenin won a central committee vote to replace the provisional government with the Petrograd Soviet, so they've finally decided they're actually going to overthrow the government. The military council gained control of the Red Guards, which is elite soldiers. 24th of October, Kerensky, which is a leader, tried to arrest the Bolshevik leaders. And then the Bolsheviks made their move, and around 8,000 Bolshevik Red Guards and the Kronstadt sailors seized key positions in Petrograd, basically overtook the entire city. Kerensky fled, and other government members met in an emergency session at the Winter Palace. And eventually, the Soviets and the Bolsheviks just broke into the Winter Palace, poorly defended by women. I'm not saying that's a link or anything. Arrested the remaining members of the government, Congress of Soviets, blah, blah, blah. Lenin led the government, blah, 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 blah. Revolution. That was it. The revolution was in charge, and Soviet Russia was about to begin.
Very, very key dates that we just missed out. In July 1917, 237 villages seized noble land. February 1917, production collapses. June 1917, 175,000 strike food. July the 3rd to the 6th, 1917, were the July days. These are all 1917, so I'm going to stop saying it. In July, the Kornilov was appointed as the Supreme Kanama. August the 22nd, Kornilov coup. August the 29th, Kornilov in prison. July to August, provisional government sends troops to help the nobility 39 times. September, the Bolsheviks win big in the Soviet election. September to October, the provisional government sends troops to help the nobility 105 times. October the 10th, Lenin returns from Finland. October the 24th, Winter Palace seized by the Bolsheviks. October the 24th, 1917, the provincial government falls.
And we're finished.
Lenin is in power.
We've finished. Finally.
That's it, apart from the next audio, which is all about exams and how to do it. So I advise that you listen to that. But for all now, thank you for listening. Goodbye from me, Will.
And me, Connor.
Have a nice day.